Good afternoon, everybody. My name is KK Poon. I'm the director of the Lloyd's Register's Foundation on Public Understanding of Risk. It's really a great pleasure for me to welcome all of you to our seminar on effective communication. As all of you know, communication plays a very important role in the formation of risk perceptions, and that in terms of influence our behavior and the way we make decisions. And so we have organized a seminar today for us to get acquainted with this very important topic. And to lead us through this topic, we have a very distinguished academic with us this afternoon. And I think you could see that on the notice that she's Professor Wändi Bruin. I hope I got that name right. And she's from a business school in Leeds University. If I may just briefly introduce Professor Wändi before I invite her to the podium. At Leeds, Professor Wändi is the University Leadership Chair in Behavioral Decision Making, and she's also a Director of the Center for Decision Research. She holds a affiliation in Carnegie Mellon as well, and also the University of Southern California and the RAND Corporation. In 2015, she was a visiting research scholar at the Dutch Central Bank. Wändi is actually a psychologist by training. Her research, which she's very well known for, is to understand and inform how people make decisions about their finances, their health, and their environmental footprint. So basically, everything she's worried about, we are worried about as an ordinary person. Or at least if you're not worried, you should start feeling worried. The idea here is that she does this in a scientific way where we just get anxious without understanding why we're anxious about. So she looks into all these ideas about judgment and decision making, risk perception, communication, behavioral change interventions, and also age differences in the way we make our decision making competency. I won't go through her very long CV, which is very distinguished, including holding membership of editorial boards on journals in psychology and decision making. And also, she has actually served on the expert panel at the US Academy of Sciences on the science of science communication. That's a very difficult sentence for me to pronounce. I got it right. I think without further ado, I think we're all very eager to hear from Wändi. And maybe I should invite her now to give us her lecture. Wändi?
Thank you, everyone, for coming. And it's a pleasure to be here at the Lloyd's Register Foundation Institute on Public Understanding of Risk. So today I'm going to talk about developing effective communications, a behavioral decision research approach. And perhaps I should say that I'll tell you in a moment what behavioral decision research is, but I'm a psychologist, basically, who studies how people make decisions. And so at the University of Leeds, I lead a Center for Decision Research, in which I have brought together academics from across the university, so not just psychologists, as well as practitioners who are interested in informing people about different risks. So, for example, I work with medical doctors who want to inform patients about health risks, financial advisors who want to talk to consumers about, for example, how to save for retirement. I work with climate scientists who are interested in working in communicating their science to members of the public. So my expertise is not in health or in climate change or in finance, but what I do know something about is how to study how people make decisions and how you can inform those decisions if people have problems in those decisions. And that's in part you see that I have different affiliations that are actually not with psychology departments, because I work with people in those disciplines to help them communicate. So at Leeds, I'm in a business school, even though I'm not a business expert. At Carnegie Mellon, I'm in an engineering department, even though I'm not an engineer. And at Leeds, I'm not just leading the Center for Decision Research, but I'm also the Deputy Director of the Priestley International Center for Climate, working with climate scientists to communicate about climate science. So I promised to tell you a little bit about behavioral decision research. this is a new field that you may or may not have heard of. And it combines insights not just from psychology, but also from economics, decision analysis, risk analysis, medical decision making, and so on, to understand how people make decisions. And it's also known under different names. So behavioral economics, behavioral insights are all terms for this kind of research, depending on what field you're in. And behavioral decision research basically takes three main approaches. The first approach is normative in nature and asks, how should people make decisions? And this is often based on economic models. So economic models suggest, I'm going to explain this in the words of a psychologist, right? But economic models basically suggest that a good decision maker should look at the available options and then carefully compare those options and choose the one that is most likely to lead the outcomes that they prefer. So that means that if you and I are looking at the same set of options, we may defensively choose something different if we have different preferences. What matters is that we have systematically gone through the options to choose the one that is most likely to lead to the outcomes that we prefer as an individual decision maker. Now, the second approach to behavioral decision research is descriptive in nature, and this is an approach that is often taken by psychologists. For example, Daniel Kahneman is a psychologist who does descriptive research into decision making, and he won a Nobel Prize in economics, even though he's not an economist, because his work with Amos Tversky led to insights about how people actually make decisions and when and why they violate normative decision theories. So you could say that the work of Kahneman and Tversky and their colleagues was basically trying to show that people don't always follow economic models. People don't always look at all of the available options. They may not always choose the option that's most aligned with their preferences. And so their research was specifically focused on those situations where people went wrong. And one criticism that you might have of that kind of work is that it was done in the lab, in the psychological lab, where often the participants were students, and they were given hypothetical decisions where they were asked to imagine that they were making a specific decision that was carefully crafted to trip them up. And so a criticism that you could have of that research, that people are making hypothetical, potentially slightly contrived decisions in the lab that might not be the same as making real-world decisions. And if people make mistakes in the lab, does that really mean that people will also make those mistakes in the real world when there are real consequences? There's a third line of behavioral decision research that I actually will be focusing on today, and that's more prescriptive in nature, and it tries to help people to make better decisions about topics that they face in the real world, including their health, their finances, sustainability of their consumer choices, and climate change. And this prescriptive approach tries to build on normative insights about how people should make decisions or could make decisions, and the descriptive approach that might highlight potential problems in people's decision making, so that you can develop communications or interventions that can help people overcome specific problems so that they can obtain better decision outcomes. So the types of communications I'm talking about here are communications that experts in different fields might develop to reach out to broader audiences. So brochures, user guides, websites, or video, where you put in a lot of investment to reach large audiences. And if you do it right, you can reach a large number of people and make a difference in their decision making. But if something goes wrong, then you might have invested a lot of time and money into something that doesn't change people's decisions. Now, the goals of those kinds of communications is typically to improve public understanding, to inform people's decisions, and sometimes also to motivate behavior change if we have a specific recommendation for how people could change their behavior to get better outcomes. Now, I have found in working with experts in different domains, including the domain of health, finance, climate change, that often experts develop communications and implement those communications without testing their effectiveness. So they put a lot of time and effort into developing brochures or websites or video without actually knowing whether those efforts improve people's understanding and inform their decisions. And it's not necessarily that easy to develop effective communications. So communications that are tested in those different domains often find that they are ineffective. So they don't change people's understanding, don't change their decisions, and don't change their behavior. And that often happens because in different domains, experts often don't think like non-experts anymore, right? So we've, as experts in whatever field you're in, you've been trained extensively to learn to look at the world in a specific way, to talk about your findings in specific words that make sense to others in your field, but those are not necessarily the words or the insights that members of the general public need to make informed decisions. And so expert jargon may be important when talking to other experts in the same domain, but it can be misunderstood when talking to non-experts or even to experts in other domains. And I've also found that when domain experts develop communications, they focus on information that they themselves find compelling, but that's not necessarily the information that people want or need to make more informed decisions. So you may then find that the single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place. So here's what I'm going to do today. I'm going to talk about 5 communication problems and solutions suggested by behavioral decision research. Then I'm going to talk about the underlying behavioral decision research methodology of those solutions. Now, those of you who are not interested in the methodology, I promise that that part will be short. And then I will end with simple take-home messages. So let's talk about those communication problems. And so what I'll do is, by the way, focus on my experiences in working on those problems in especially the United States and the United Kingdom, because that's where I've done most of my work. I've only been in Singapore for 2 days, so I won't be able to apply this a lot to the Singapore context. But I think that maybe in the discussion we can talk about that. What I hope that you'll find is that at least some of these problems are general enough that they generalize across disciplines and across cultures. But we can discuss. All right, so these are the 5 problems I'll be focusing on. Using confusing wording, failing to address relevant gaps in people's knowledge or skill sets, pushing one alternative or presenting too many alternatives, and misunderstanding the motivations that the audience have for engaging in specific behaviors. So let's look at the first one, using confusing wording. So I don't know if you've heard of the term 100-year flood. If you're in engineering, risk analysis, insurance, then this may be a term that you've heard of. And if you've not heard of it, then let me tell you what I think experts in those domains mean. So 100-year flood is a term that is used for the type of flood that happens on average once every 100 years. So this is a flood that is pretty extreme, right? If it only happens once every 100 years. And it happens on average once every 100 years, not necessarily exactly every 100 years. Now, when experts in flooding or engineering or related fields talk about floods, this is a term that they prefer to use. You'll see this a lot in scientific literature about flooding, but you also see it appear in communications to members of the general public who may not be familiar with this term, 100-year flood. And so research on communication of this term has suggested there's a systematic misunderstanding of this term. And that is, when people hear the term 100-year flood, they expect it to happen exactly every 100 years. And so this cartoon explains this. And I know that if you talk through a cartoon, it makes it no longer funny, but I'm going to do it anyway. So there's two people standing in this tower. The water is reaching almost the 1998 high water mark. The cartoon is written in 2002, so it's only 4 years later. So that's why the one person says to the other, "Isn't it about 96 years too early for another 100-year flood?" Now, like I said, research in communications has suggested that people interpret this term exactly in the way as this cartoon shows, and that perhaps a better way of communicating the same idea, that this is an extreme flood that on average happens once every 100 years, it might be better to say that this is a flood with a 1% chance of happening each year. Because when you say it that way, people do understand that this flood could happen 2 years in a row. It's just not very likely that that's the case. And so you could, of course, say, well, 1%, do people know exactly what 100% is? Maybe not, but they realize that it's a small chance, and that a flood with a small chance of happening may happen in a particular year. It could happen another year. It doesn't have to be 100 years later. So if your main goal is to communicate that this is a flood with a small chance, but it won't happen exactly 100 years apart, then that would be a better term. Now, you could say, okay, well, is this important for people to know? And I'll give you an example where it would have been important for people to know. This picture here is of a town named Grimma in Germany. I don't know if anybody is familiar with this town. But Grimma had a flood in the early 2000s. And it was described by the local governments and policymakers as a 100-year flood. Then, after the flood, there was a town meeting where it was proposed to build a flood wall to protect against another 100-year flood happening. And the people of the town protested against the wall, in part because they thought it was ugly. And it's a very cute town, so they don't want to make their town ugly. But they also argued that if this is indeed a 100-year flood, then it's going to take another 100 years for this flood to happen. Why would we have to suffer by looking at a flood wall where it's going to protect us against consequences that we won't face in our lifetime? So the flood wall was not built. And then within the next 10 years, they had another 100-year flood. And so perhaps having had this flood explained as something that had a 1% chance of happening each year might have changed that policy decision. And if you think that this only happens in Germany, I did notice that in Singapore, the term 50-year flood has been used. I realize 100-year flood is perhaps a term that you might not use if your country is not 100 years old. But the term 50-year flood does appear in Singapore media. I don't know the details of this, but I would still say you probably want to be careful and use that kind of terminology, because it does lead to the question, at least this journalist asked it, isn't this sort of thing only supposed to happen once every 50 years? The journalist asked when this flood happened multiple times. Okay, next issue, if that's okay with you. Failing to address relevant gaps. And I'd like to talk about the example of a sex education program that I developed while working in the United States in the 1990s. So at that time, I was working at Carnegie Mellon, and local medical doctors who were working at an adolescent clinic came to us because they wanted to develop a sex education program to reduce sexually transmitted infections in teenage girls. Because in an adolescent clinic, that's a large part of the work that they do. And they had done a review of the sex education programs that were available to American teenagers at the time. And most of those sex education programs, if they had been evaluated, were shown not to be effective. So they had no effect on teenage sexual behavior or teenage risk of sexually transmitted infections. And it was probably because most of those sex education programs were doing the same thing. They were just repeating the same basic facts. They were telling American teenagers that they should be abstinent until marriage, or that if they did choose to have sex, they should use condoms. And that is, of course, reasonable advice from public health experts, because their research has shown that those things might be good ideas if you want to protect against sexually transmitted infections. But when we interviewed teenage girls about doing those things, they said they found it difficult to talk to their partners about abstaining from sex until marriage or using condoms, because they were worried that if they brought up those kinds of things, that their partners wouldn't be interested in them or would be offended. And so they didn't know how to bring it up. And so our program did something different from the existing programs at the time. That is, we filled a gap in teenage girls' knowledge or skill set, and that is, we helped them to talk to their partners. So the video would show different characters interacting with partners, and then would freeze at different times, and then ask the viewer, what would you do in this situation? It asked the viewer to think in their head and practice in their head what they would say to their partners if they were in the same situation as the character in the video. Psychologists call that cognitive rehearsal, which is an example of psychologists using jargon, but it basically just means you practice in your head what you're going to do when faced with a difficult situation. And research in psychology had already shown at that time that if you practice in your head what you're going to say when facing a difficult situation, then you're more likely to actually say these things when you're faced with that difficult situation, because it increases your confidence and your ability to implement it, to say it. So we tested our video by showing it to the patients at that adolescent clinic. They were randomly assigned to a video or control. We followed them for 6 months and found that after 6 months, the viewers of the video were less likely to be infected with sexually transmitted infections, suggesting that the video changed their behavior. And when we looked at their self-reports, they self-reported that they were indeed less likely to have sex once they knew how to talk to their partners. And if they did choose to have sex, they were more likely to use condoms. Then years later, Obama became president, and he commissioned a review of all sex education programs that had been developed in the United States since 1989. This review was done by the Department of Health and Human Services in the United States, and ours was recognized of just one of 4 programs out of all the ones that were developed since 1989 that were effective in terms of changing adolescent health outcomes. Here's another example that we're currently working on in the United Kingdom, where we hope to also be addressing relevant gaps in people's skill sets. So this is an intervention where the evaluation is still ongoing. It is a collaboration with the Citizens Advice Bureau in the United Kingdom. And what the Citizens Advice Bureau does, it gives financial advice to people who have financial problems. And one of the frustrations that financial advisors sometimes have is that the clients that they see are in serious psychological distress because it's very stressful to have financial problems. And so they were worried that if people are that stressed out, that they don't have the ability to focus on the financial advice and to implement the financial advice that they receive from the financial advisors at the Citizens Advice Bureau. So what we are doing at the University of Leeds with the Librium Fellowships to one of my postdocs, Simon McNair, is we've developed an intervention that takes insights from psychological counseling to help people reduce their stress. And we're randomly assigning the clients of the Citizens Advice Bureau to receiving this intervention. And we're hoping that by reducing people's psychological stress about their finances, that they will feel better, but that they will then also have better financial outcomes because their reduced stress, we hope, will help them to implement the financial advice that they're getting. So next time I'm in Singapore, I'll update you on the outcomes of this intervention. And so a third problem that I'd like to focus on is pushing one alternative, which I've also found often happening when experts in a particular domain are developing communications. The example I'd like to focus on is a project on carbon capture and storage. I don't know if you've heard of this technology. I had not heard of this technology when I started working on it. So again, this is going to be a psychologist's words for describing a technology that's not in my field. But carbon capture and storage is a technology that can be added to coal-fired power plants to capture CO2 emissions and put them deep underground. So the engineers who are working on this technology see it as a potential technology to help curb climate change, because if you take CO2 emissions and put them deep underground, those CO2 emissions would not be contributing to climate change. And so it reduces the CO2 emissions of electricity generation from coal-fired power plants. That's the idea. And it's not like this technology would be the only one that you could use in electricity generation, but it could be part of a portfolio of electricity generation technologies that have lower carbon emissions. Now, the engineers at Carnegie Mellon were working on this technology, and they said that they had realized from looking at nuclear power that if you don't engage with the public about the risks of your technologies, that there might be public protest against your technology. And if there's public protest, then your technology won't be implemented. And so they wanted me to work with them to find out what people think of this carbon capture and storage technology. Now, at the time, it was really new. Like I said, I hadn't heard about it. But I said, sure, I'll work with you and I'll interview people about this technology. I tried that. It was actually very difficult to do because when I asked people what they thought about carbon capture and storage, it turned out they hadn't heard about it. So I went back to the engineers and said, I can't interview people about this because they don't know what it is, so they need to have some description. So the engineers started working on a communication that briefly described carbon capture and storage, and then also described the risks and benefits of the technology. And I gave my interviewees that information one step at a time, and then asked them what they thought. And so this is what I learned. People did not like this technology. The more they learned, the less they liked it. They said things like that it reminded them of nuclear waste, where you take stuff that comes out of dirty factories and you put it underground or in the environment where it doesn't belong and could potentially have negative effects that you don't know to expect. They also, when I gave them information about the risks and benefits, focused on the risks and not so much on the benefits, which fits with insights from behavioral decision research that losses tend to loom larger than gains, or negative things tend to capture people's attention more than positive things. And this was the case with this technology as well. And then another thing that I learned from those interviews is that some interviewees started suggesting, well, why can't we instead work on solar power or wind power? Those are also low carbon electricity generation technologies. Why don't you talk to me about those technologies instead? Suggesting that they didn't like that I was just giving them information about one alternative. So I went back to the engineers and said, if you want to communicate to people about carbon capture and storage, you have to tell them what the alternatives look like. So We developed communications about coal with carbon capture and storage, but also a bunch of other alternatives that were feasible for electricity generation. I know you can't read these sheets. The point of showing these sheets is that we had multiple sheets, and they focused on different low carbon electricity generation technologies, including the ones that people wanted to talk about. And then systematically for every technology, we covered the same features, the risks and the benefits that the engineers thought were important, but also features that people wanted to know about. And we systematically did that for every technology, and then people received these communications. They could compare them and put them on the table and shift them around and systematically compare them and then look at which ones they liked. And a little bit to my surprise, when giving people the range of options, they became more positive about carbon capture and storage. I'm not saying that they were enthusiastic, but they were more positive about it than when they were considering the technology on its own. And I think that what might have potentially happened is that when people see multiple technologies for reducing the CO2 emissions of electricity generation, they realize perhaps that all technologies have risks and benefits. So then the risks of one technology no longer stand out per se, because every technology has risks and benefits. And so it made people more willing to accept carbon capture and storage, especially as part of an electricity generation portfolio. Those materials are available online at Carnegie Mellon's Climate and Energy Decision Making Center. A fourth problem that I would like to highlight is the flip side of this, is that it's presenting too many alternatives. So presenting alternatives may be a good thing, but if you present too many, then it's too difficult for people to keep them all in mind. You may have heard, or may not have heard, of research by Sheena Iyengar and colleagues, where her research assistants were standing in the supermarket trying to sell jams. In one picture here, you see them in front of a table with 24 jams, and the other one, 6 jams. Now, if you ask consumers how many alternatives they want, they might say as many as possible. But what they found in this study is that people are actually more likely to purchase jams from the table with the fewer options. And the suggestion at the time was that too many options just leads to choice overload. It is too overwhelming to choose, to figure out which is the best one to pick, and then people just don't pick any. So sometimes less is more. Now, research in memory has suggested that people can keep in mind, on average, about 5 to 9 options. So that's probably the ideal. Now, let's look at what happens in other domains when people receive suggestions from experts. So I worked in the energy domain, and with electricity companies trying to reduce electricity use by their consumers. And I've seen lists of 50 to 100 tips of things you can do in your home to save electricity. That's a lot of tips, and much more than people tend to be able to keep in memory. And perhaps it is not a surprise that when we asked Americans about the most effective thing that they could do in their home to save electricity, they said turning off the lights. And of course, turning off the lights is a good thing to do if you want to save electricity, but it's not the best thing you can do to save electricity in your home. If you're going to try to save electricity in your home, the appliances, at least in the United States, that use the most electricity in people's household is the air conditioner, is the number one, and then also the dryer. So if you change the thermostat on your air conditioner or use your dryer less, you will save more electricity than by worrying about switching off the lights. So it's been suggested by psychologists that if electricity providers want to encourage people to save electricity, perhaps the electricity providers would be better off to focus on fewer tips and also the most effective tips for saving electricity in the home and not just turning off the lights. And I also think it will make families happier. I don't know whether this is true in Singapore, but anecdotal evidence that I have from families around me in the United States and the United Kingdom is that there are a lot of arguments in families about who left on the lights. But but not so many arguments about who turned up the air conditioner, which would be the more effective way to save electricity in the home. And now the fifth one, misunderstanding people's motivations. I'll start with an energy example also. So in working with electricity providers, I've noticed that advertisements that try to encourage energy savings try to convince consumers to save electricity so that they can save money. These come from different American advertisers right here. With the idea being that what motivates consumers is to save money. Now, in interviews I've done with different consumers is that it's not true for everyone, but there are actually consumers who are worried about the environment and would like to save electricity because it's good for the environment. And research in psychology has suggested, not just psychology, but including in psychology, that if you pay people for things that they like to do, then the thing that they like to do no longer is that enjoyable. So if you pay, for example, let's say a student for working on something that they enjoy, then paying them money for it may make them no longer enjoy it so much. Or paying people for blood donations, which people might do to feel good, to do something for others. If you pay people for it, then it may no longer make them feel so good because it makes them feel like they're doing it for the money, even if they're not really doing it for the money. So in that light, my colleagues and I were concerned that if you tell consumers that they can save money by saving energy, you might be undermining that warm glow, at least for the pro-environmental consumers who want to save electricity because it makes them feel good, because they want to do something for the environment. So we worked with an electricity provider and tested 3 advertisements. Sorry for the wordy slide, but I wanted to show that the advertisements were the same except for their emphasis. So this is just one sentence out of every advertisement, but it would emphasize the monetary benefits, the environmental benefits, or both. So the first one said, we are offering a new program that will help you to save money. By using less electricity, you can reduce your electricity bill. The second one would say, by using less electricity, you can reduce your environmental impact. And then the third one emphasized both, because when we had talked to the electricity provider and said, emphasizing the monetary benefits may not be a good idea, they said, well, why don't we just do both? We'll emphasize the monetary benefits and the environmental benefits so that consumers who care about money can see that, but then people who care about the environment will notice that too. We were concerned that if you emphasize the money, whether it was with the environmental benefits or without, it would undermine people's warm glow. And that's what we found. The most effective advertisement was the one that emphasized the environmental benefits. As soon as you mention money on its own or in combination with the environmental benefits, that made consumers less willing to sign up for energy-saving programs. And this was, of course, especially true for pro-environmental consumers. So advertising environmental benefits alone improved willingness to enroll compared to advertising monetary benefits on their own or combined with environmental benefits. And then the last example is from the domain of public health, and particular to the United Kingdom, where the weather is very different than in Singapore. So I hope you bear with me for this example. If you've been to the UK, then you know it tends to be much less hot than in Singapore. But the UK does have heat waves. the heat waves are still not as hot as it is in Singapore right now. But the thing is, heat waves are locally defined. And that's true for a reason, because a heat wave affects, for example, people's 5 degrees of increased temperature over a prolonged number of days affects people differently depending on what they're used to, right? So if it's 5 degrees hotter than what you're used to, you're going to feel the effects. So British people, when it's in the higher 20s, they're having a hard time because they're not used to it, right? And it's the same thing with the infrastructure. The infrastructure is built to cope with a more moderate temperature. So when those temperatures go up, it's harder. It's harder for the for people to deal with it. So in the UK, weather forecasters have collaborated with Public Health England to give heat protection warnings because they're concerned that people in the UK are not protecting against heat. So when it's hot, the recommendation is, and you may know this already being in Singapore, but to stay out of the sun, especially during the hottest hours of the day, to drink a lot of water, to avoid excess alcohol use, to avoid exercising in the heat. Now, often in the UK, when it gets hot, that's exactly what people are not doing. They're going out when it's hot. They're not drinking enough water, drinking more alcohol than usual. And perhaps they're also exercising because they want to be outdoors. Like I said, the weather forecasters were collaborating with Public Health England to communicate heat protection warnings when hot weather was expected. So they would go on the radio, predict the weather, say, so tomorrow it's going to be hot. And that's why we want you to stay out of the sun, especially the hottest time of day, drink more water, avoid excess alcohol, avoid exercising outdoors. And the idea was that those kinds of heat protection warnings would increase the perceived effectiveness of those behaviors and then lead people to implement those behaviors. And this is what we found in our studies. But what we also found is that because it doesn't get very warm in the UK very often, that when hot weather is predicted, people have positive emotions. They get excited about the idea of it going to be hot. And those positive emotions undermine their willingness to implement those heat protection behaviors. So positive emotions about heat can undermine willingness to implement those recommendations from public health experts. So what we recommended is to develop communications that perhaps try to temper those positive emotions, not by making people feel bad about heat, but perhaps making them feel less excited about how hot it's going to be. And so I'll not go into the full detail of this, but what we found is that in the UK, when it gets hot, it is actually common for people to have negative experiences because they're not used to that heat. The thing is, over the longer run, what they remember is their positive experiences with heat. So interventions that reminded people of their own unpleasant experiences with heat reduced or tempered the positive emotions and increased their willingness to implement heat protection behavior. So showing potential promise for addressing people's emotions about heat, at least in the UK. So what's the underlying methodology of those solutions I've suggested that came from behavioral decision research to address those communication problems? So it's called the mental models methodology, which is another jargony term that has been developed in this field. And as you can see, the structure looks very similar to the different approaches in behavioral decision research. So there's a more normative step that asks, what are the recommendations for how people should make decisions, or what should they know to make more informed decisions? So in this step, the methodology is typically to conduct an interdisciplinary literature review or to interview experts in the different domains to find out what the main recommendations are for effectively making decisions in this particular domain. So what are the recommendations that experts have that have an evidence in terms of actually leading to better outcomes? The second step is to find out what people already know and how they're actually making their decisions. Because a lot of expert recommendations may already be familiar to people, or people may have figured out some way to make informed decisions that experts haven't thought of. So understanding how people are approaching the problem is important. And then in the third step, the goal is to find out what is it that people still need and want to know to make more informed decisions. And so in that step, you would compare the expert recommendations with what people are already doing and what they're not doing and what they want to be doing. And then in the fourth step, we look at whether communication is effective. And we do tests, evaluation tests that might include a randomized controlled trial, where you take the communication you've developed, you randomly assign it to your potential audience members, with about half receiving your communication and the other half an alternative communication or whatever is common at the time. And if your communication is effective, then the people who receive your communication should show more understanding and more informed decisions as compared to the controls. Because without the test, even if you followed all of these steps, it doesn't necessarily mean that your communication will be effective, because it's not that easy to do. So if you want to learn more about the methodology, because I promised to keep it short, so for more detail, I'll point you to some books. So the first one is Risk Communication, a Mental Models Approach, written by Granger Morgan, Baruch Fischoff, and Bostrom and Cindy Atman. That one is focused specifically on problems that engineers might find important in terms of, it focuses on technical problems that engineers might want to communicate to members of the public. The second book is called Communicating Risks and Benefits, an Evidence-Based User Guide. It gives similar advice, but it's more focused on the health domain. And what I like about the second book, it's also available for free online from the Food and Drug Administration in the United States. So I put the link on my slide. I hope you don't mind a little bit of self-promotion. I've written an article for the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences with Ann Bostrom, where we also go into the details on how to develop effective communications, which you might also find interesting. It's shorter than the books. And if you don't like to read, there's also a YouTube video in which I gave a presentation to the American National Academy of Sciences on how to develop effective communications. So take-home messages. So I hope you take away that from those 5 examples that it's important when trying to communicate to non-expert audiences or people who are not experts in your field. They might be experts in other fields. It's important to avoid confusing wording, to address relevant gaps in people's knowledge and skill set, to not just push one alternative, but also not present too many alternatives, and to address people's motivations. Now, if that's too much to remember, because I know 5 is already reaching the limit of what's easy to remember, then perhaps remember these things. It's important to know your audience, to understand how they talk and think about the problem at hand and what they want to know to make more informed decisions. And to test your communications to see if they're actually effective in terms of changing people's understanding and decision making. And behavioral decision researchers can help. So behavioral decision researchers do not necessarily have expertise in health or in finance or sustainability or climate change or whatever topic it is that you want to communicate about. But behavioral decision researchers do have expertise in trying to understand different audiences and trying to test communications for their effectiveness. So developing effective communications might require interdisciplinary teams, including domain experts who know about the topic at hand, but also experts in social science and communications who can bring that information to the different audiences. There are lots of other projects in the Center for Decision Research that I would like to talk about, but I can't go on forever. But let me highlight a couple of them. So I already talked about our project on reducing financial distress in people with financial problems. We're also working on improving consumers' decisions about the climate impact of their food choices, where we're finding that it's kind of similar to the domain of energy savings, where consumers are not necessarily focusing, pro-environmental consumers who want to change the climate impact of their food choices don't actually know what the most effective things are for reducing the climate impact of the food choices. So one of those things might be, for example, to reduce your intake of red meat. Whereas consumers tend to be more focused on reducing the packaging of their food choices, which is also important, but it doesn't have as much of a reduction of climate impact. We're also working with health experts who are trying to reach out to people about cancer screening to make those kinds of communications more easier to understand and make it more likely that people will show up for their cancer screenings in the UK. And we're working with the UK Met Office, who are developing climate projections, specifically focused on increasing temperatures and increasing rainfall in the UK. But the graphs that they produce about those climate projections are very complicated. They're very beautiful graphs with beautiful colors about long-term projections of rainfall and temperatures, but there's so much information crammed into those graphs that the audience that those graphs are meant for do not necessarily understand those graphs. And the specific audiences that they have in mind are stakeholders from business and industry who need to plan on the basis of climate projections on how to make investments or how to change policy. And those stakeholders from business and industry are not necessarily experts in climate science, so they don't necessarily understand those complex graphs. So we're working with the Met Office to see if we can test their graphs and help to simplify them so they get across the main messages to the people they are intending to reach. Thank you very much for your attention. And I'm happy to answer questions if you have any.
Thank you very much for the presentation. Yes, we welcome any question from the audience.
Yes, I'd be happy to make the slides available. How do we do that?
We'll make it available online.
Okay, we'll make them available online.
And one question on the terms that you have been using. If we can go back to the one of the first slides, you were discussing about, go for previously.
Behavioral decision.
Okay, this. How should people make this? Yeah, the first one. How should people make decision? And I understand that this you were considering subjective decision, not objective decision.
Because so decisions that people face in their lives about their health and their finances, and so on.
But because so then you spoke about taking a wrong decision, but if the decision are subjective, in the moment in which we take that decision, because our values are changed by external influences that have changed out the way we are looking at things.
Right.
So I don't. So from an engineering point of view, I'm sorry, I'm an engineer. So I understand your point, but the wording is not that one is right and the other is wrong. Is that there has been an external factor, external influence that has changed what would have been otherwise a more meaningful decision.
Right.
So, but you understand my point?
I think I do. So what you're trying to say, it's difficult to sometimes say what's right or wrong.
Yes. No, is that, I mean, if we abstract ourselves from the problem that we are facing, we are supposed to take a more reasonable approach, a more rational approach.
Mm-hmm.
But when we are in the midst of it, and then emotions kicks in, or fear kicks in,
yeah,
then what we consider in a normal situation is completely different.
Right.
So we have a pressure, and so we take a decision with different parameters in respect of what we consider we should be doing.
Right.
So so what I probably I haven't understood from your presentation is you have tackled the more objective external influence, which is lack of information, lack of options, too many options. But there are also, let's say, I would say, some psychological factors, and I would like you to comment on those.
Right. So the last example focused on motivation and emotions, which may also affect people's decision making. So there's actually debate on whether emotions are good or bad for decision making, and it may depend. But the example that I focused on, where showing that depending on people's motivations and emotions, that might change their decisions. So it's important to also know about those. And so I hope that the main point, one of the main points that I hope to have gotten across, is that sometimes experts don't realize what those emotions and motivations are. And so they make recommendations and assume that people will be able to implement them if they just tell people that those are the recommendations. But it's not always that simple, because there might be other things going on, including not having enough information. But it could also be emotional factors or motivational factors that lead people to not implement those recommendations, even if they would want to. And so understanding why people are not implementing recommendations is important. Skipping the step of trying to understand it might mean that your communication focuses on something that is not actually the issue. So often communicators assume that what people is missing is information. So they throw more information at people, hoping that that will solve the problem. But that's not always the problem. Like you said, sometimes it's emotional or motivational. So understanding what's going on and why people are not implementing a recommendation that they might actually want to implement, or that experts recommend that they implement to obtain desired outcomes, is an important step before developing the communication. And it's not as simple as it sounds, but
Thank you so much for your presentation. I thought it was wonderfully clear and refreshing. You spoke about knowing your audience. And I guess another audience, in addition to sort of the general public, of whom you spoke most of the time, is policymakers.
Right.
And policymakers are subject not only to all the kind of standard biases involved in decision making that everybody else is, but also other sorts of pressures. I mean, one, to take decisions under pressure and very quickly. Another might be the extra source of uncertainty of trying to guess what public opinion is and what and how that might they might need to respond to that. Has any of your work touched on the decision-making processes of policymakers and how experts can communicate better with policymakers?
Not as much as it should have, but policymakers are people too. Like you said, they have some of the same barriers to informed decision-making that any of us might face. It's only recently that I've moved towards developing communications for policymakers, and that's the example that I talked about with the Met Office, where the Met Office is developing communications about climate projections, including complicated-looking graphs about projected rainfall and temperatures that policymakers are, and people from business also, are interested in for deciding about the future. So that's I must admit, that's my first project where I focused on policymakers per se. So far I can say the issues seem to be similar. That the Met Office communications seem to assume that people need all of this information, but the information is too much and presented in too complicated a way for policymakers to understand. And that's the step where we are at. We have not yet produced this simplified graphs to see if that actually helps policymakers and changes their insights, and then helps them to make decisions about policies and their communications to the public. So there's a lot of steps that need to be taken there, and so I'm learning how to do this. There are others whose expertise it is to develop communications for policymakers. My research has mostly focused on the general public.
We just hear first, then we'll move up the line.
Thank you. On your advice number 3, which is pushing one alternative, I think.
Yes.
Yeah. Why would you say that is not the case where you actually have educated the audience about the various technologies about CCS, and rather than just giving them different alternatives? In that sense, you are actually educating the audience.
Am I educating the audience?
Yeah, as a result, they can make better decisions,
right,
rather than just simply presenting them different alternatives to technologies.
I'm not sure that I understand.
So see, if you may go back to your slides,
sure,
where you show the intervention that you took.
It's coming. Sorry, here we go.
The next one. Yeah. So essentially, you are educating the audience, right?
Yes.
Right. So it is this education that makes them make better decisions.
In this case, yes.
Right. Rather than is a case of pushing one alternative versus pushing several alternatives.
Right. So the initial goal of this project was to communicate people about carbon capture and storage. When I did that, the response is very negative, and people focused on the risks rather than the benefits of the technology. And I think they also sort of distrusted the communication because it was missing communication about alternatives. So focusing on carbon capture and storage alone made people feel negative about it, and but then giving them communications about a range of options, including carbon capture and storage, made them feel more relatively less negative about the technology. Let's say, not say more positive, but less negative. So yes, by showing that there are more alternatives, people like that one alternative better. So it might be, if experts are an expert in one particular technology, their intuition might be to push information about that technology. But that might actually not, it might not actually work in terms of influencing people's belief of that technology. It also doesn't help them to make more informed decisions, because to make an informed decision, you need the full range of alternatives. And so showing the range of alternatives would make decisions more informed, because people can actually make an informed decision, but it actually makes them like that one option better, the option that experts may have a tendency to want to push if left to their own devices. I actually also think it increases trust, but we didn't measure trust in that project.
There's one here, there's one here.
Thank you for the wonderful and interesting sharing. My question is coming from the context of considering further education in psychology and or doing such interesting work. I'm curious, when you meet people socially, has your experience been largely questions around your work? I experienced some of that when I share that I have a psychology background, so I'm wondering, when you do more specialized work like that, does a lot of the social interactions tend to, people get very interested, and sometimes you just want to talk about other topics, or I'm curious. Yeah.
I actually really like my work, so I don't mind talking about it.
Okay.
So I hope you do ask questions afterwards also, because I think there are refreshments waiting. But it's also actually often the case that if people know my work, then they ask me questions about my work. But if they don't know my work and they just hear that I'm a psychologist, they assume that I'm a counselor, so that they think that I can help them with personal problems, or that I can even look in their head and understand them entirely just by talking to them in 5 minutes, which is, I promise you, that's not true.
Yes.
Oh.
Yourself. And who else had a question? Everyone had the question. Oh, okay.
With terrible twos. I'm sorry to say I have no expertise in communicating with terrible twos. And if you've done it, you may have more expertise on it than I do. I think they're a particular kind of audience that are the field of study of developmental psychologists.
My name is Tong Wei. I'm a physician. I have interest in this aspect as well, but I just want to ask a provocative question.
Oh.
From your experience of studies, do you eventually find a lot of things are common sense that you just have to, and in a lot of your work, you actually demonstrate them, and basically filling the gap between a so-called expert and the public?
Yeah.
And in that sense, do most experts lack common sense? Thank
Do
you.
most experts lack common sense? Yes and no. So I think domain experts know a lot about their particular domain, but that makes it harder for them to communicate to others who don't know about their particular domain. Because I think we have, maybe all of us have a tendency to think that others are much more like us than they really are. And so we don't realize how others are different and how to address that in communications. And I don't think it's just experts. This may just be the human condition. And so trying to understand others is an important part of any communication, from experts to non-experts, but even from us to each other, even if we're not experts.
Hi. It's a bit of a follow-up question to the notion of emotions and feelings, because when I looked at this methodology slide, if I simplify it, it sounded a bit like, give them the information, they make good decisions. But then, for example, you have a concrete example, the notion of parents don't vaccinate their children.
Yeah.
Objectively, the knowledge is out there, vaccines don't cause autism.
Yeah.
But then you have the problem of people don't trust the news sources.
Yeah.
There are information bubbles, there's confirmation bias and other biases. So where does this, in my opinion, also very, very important, but fit into the whole bigger picture?
No, you make an important point. It's also a problem with the name of the mental model. With the methodology, which is called the mental models methodology, which sounds like, mental model means it's what your views are, what your knowledge is of a particular domain. It comes out of the field of educational psychology, where researchers have studied, for example, how children develop knowledge about scientific topics. So this is it is a methodology that has developed from education, where the focus is on sharing information and helping people to get the correct information about a specific scientific field. The methodology has since developed further to recognize that often it's not just about decisions in life. It's often not just information that's missing. It's also emotion, motivation. There may be other things going on that lead people to not implement specific recommendations. And so the methodology is still called mental models. The steps are still described as, and perhaps I should have put more effort into describing the steps where you talk to your audience, not just as looking at information, but more looking at how are they making their decisions, and why are they not what are the barriers they face in those decisions, so that it sounds less like it's just always information that is undermining the effective decision. Now, if you look at the readings that I recommended, you'll see that development also over time in those readings. So the Mental Models book by Granger Morgan and colleagues was the first one on this methodology, which very much focused on providing information. The later one by the Food and Drug Administration already focuses more on emotions and motivations and other maybe environmental barriers also in decision making. And then the PNAS paper, which is the most recent one of the most recent ones, addresses those things in more detail. So your criticism is valid, and perhaps I should change the wording of that slide a little bit. Yes.
Thank you for the amazing presentation. I was just wondering, like, because most of the work you've shown is like with regards to like large-scale advertisements, like does the 5 problems you've mentioned apply to the same degree to all types, all medias of communication? Like in particular, like texting, for example, you can't present with 6 different options for other people to consider. They just be like, oh, this text is too long, I don't want to read it, for example.
You're right. So are you're saying it doesn't apply to all platforms?
As in, like, these problems might be like significant for like advertising and such, but like such as communication, like face to face or like on text, they might not be as important.
Yeah. So as I noticed in one of the earlier slides, these insights are particularly for developing brochures, websites, videos, those kinds of communications where you have more space than in a text. But you're developing a communication that goes out to large audiences. So face-to-face communications and texting are different. So 2 examples that you mentioned. So face-to-face, at least if you're going into a direction with your communication that is not understood, you get some feedback from the person you're trying to communicate to, right? So they might look confused, or they might just tell you that they don't understand what you're saying, and then you can change how you're presenting information or address the barriers that come up in that conversation. So in face-to-face conversations, it's easier to correct for any problems in communications as long as your communication partner is indicating that they're not understanding something. And of course, texting has a whole different issue. Tweeting and other media like that, where you only have a certain number of words, where you can't squeeze in everybody. You may need to put in links to websites or videos or those kinds of mass communications, and that pique people's initial interest to get them to the fuller intervention. So yeah, the issues may be different depending on the communication platform. You're right.
So I'm just wondering, like, has there been any like research like with regards to like the bigger problems in like texting, for example?
I think that research is only just developing.
Oh, cool. Thank you.
And yeah.
You have a question?
Hey, I was really interested in the whole idea of the providing alternatives, because in particular in your coal case study, I'm really interested to hear who was in charge of producing the alternatives brochures. Because, for example, I'm working on flood forecasting, and I often talk to decision makers, and I want them to be making the best decisions, but at the same time, I have one product that I think is a bit better.
Yeah.
And how do you... It's a very difficult thing to be approaching in a neutral sense. You can never really be truly neutral. And people can then clock onto it if you're obviously being very biased.
Yeah, so you're right. So it's very hard to, even when you try to be neutral, if you have a preference, it might leak through in how you develop things, right? So these communications were developed with experts who had expertise in all of these technologies. So it was an iterative process between the experts, so that it wouldn't favor just one of the technologies that they liked. But actually, intended audience members were also involved in the development, so that the communication wouldn't just address what experts found important, but also what the intended audience members found important, and used wording that the experts agreed was correct, the experts from the different domains agreed that, or technologies agreed was correct, but then also that then intended audience members agreed was understandable. And that's a whole different tension also that I didn't address in my presentation. That if you try to simplify your communication so that it's easier for people to understand, sometimes experts become upset because they feel like it loses accuracy. Because to experts, the expert jargon or terminology, I should say, has specific meaning that is important to use when communicating between experts. But if you don't use that specific term anymore, and you use an everyday term, then experts sometimes feel you lose something. And so trying to find that balance between experts in the different technologies so that they all agree that it's correct and not biased towards one or the other, and non-experts also agreeing that the wording is simple enough for them to understand, is an iterative process that actually makes developing communications quite a challenge. And then you haven't even tested them yet. That was just a development process.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
But I do think that's important.
One last question.
Wändi, thank you for that very fascinating talk. I just wanted to hear your thoughts on what's the future of behavioral decision research. Is it the genetic basis of it? Is it the use of big data? Is it cross-cultural basis? Where is the field going? Thank you.
Wow, you want me to answer that? Well, the thing is, the field is relatively young, right? So behavioral decision research, it hasn't even settled on a name yet. Behavioral decision research, behavioral economics, behavioral insights. It's a relatively new field. There's still so many developments going on. Just to tell you how much it has grown, when the field started, well, you can argue about exactly when it started, but in the 1980s, people like my PhD advisor, Baruch Fischoff, and the others who were working in this field could fit in one room, and they all knew each other and were aware of each other's work. Now, yes, how long ago is the 1980s? It doesn't seem like that long ago, but we're a few generations of researchers in, and there are multiple conferences on decision making, from psychology, from economics, in medical decision making, and so they're all going in different directions. So I think the future of the field, I think that answer is difficult to give because the field has already spun off in different directions depending on what your main focus is. And so I like that the field has moved out of the lab and has, because traditionally a lot of the research in behavioral decision making was in the lab to try to find out find out when and why people violate economic models, and that was important to do, to show that economic models don't always apply to people's decision making, and that there are exceptions where economic models don't apply. But it didn't really help real world decision making, and the field has such promise for that, because if you try to understand people's decisions, you can use it then to inform their decisions if you look at their decisions in the real world. So I'm excited about the field moving into the real world and helping people with a wide variety of real world decisions. And then how that is done, it just depends on this particular problem that you're focusing on and what the barrier is to informed decision making. So I'm interested and excited about seeing risk communication develop in different ways and in different platforms, and looking at new media. But I've also been interested in seeing nudge interventions develop, where the focus is more on changing people's choice environment and not even worrying about giving people information or changing how they make decisions directly, but then changing their environment so that they automatically choose what you recommend if you have a recommendation. And how those kinds of interventions, risk communications, nudging, and so on, have moved in the domain of public policy, where in different countries there are behavioral insight teams working with government institutions to help people make decisions about health, finance, retirement savings, and so many different domains. And I think all of those are interesting, and it will lead to a suite of options for helping experts and policymakers to inform people's decisions, hopefully for the better of all of us.
All right, let's put our hands together to thank Professor Wändi.
Thank you.